When and how does one obtain an emergency custody order? Well, my name is Akiva Goldman. I'm the director and founder of Goldman and Associates. Our firm has a primary focus on family law issues here in Michigan, and today we're going to continue our video series designed to educate and inform the public, so please subscribe to our channel. There's such a thing as emergency orders, and the court has a method by which somebody can get emergency relief. The court has to be satisfied when you get emergency relief that a couple things are going on. Number one, the first order of business, is it an emergency as defined by the court? The reason why I add that little phrase in, as defined by the court, is because what you think an emergency is, most of the time the court doesn't view it that way. I'll have parents who will call me up and say, so-and-so is supposed to bring the child home at 6 o'clock. 6:25, the child's not home. I call, no answer. I said, oh, it's an emergency. You need to file an emergency motion. Imagine them telling us what we need to file. All right, that's a different story. Clients like to do that. Or the courteous ones will ask, can we file an emergency motion? I'll tell you what the answer is to both. Unless this guy, who's 25 minutes late, is a drug addict or an alcoholic, or you have some reason to believe that there's some harm being done, the court's not likely to view that as an emergency. The fact that he's late could be a function of being tied up in traffic. The phone may be on mute. You know what happens? When I do these videos to provide information to the public, I turn my phone off because I don't want it ringing during the video. You know what happens sometimes? I forget to turn it back on. Things come up. In the context of running the firm and handling cases and dealing with clients, sometimes things come up and you forget. He's 25 minutes late. Maybe something came up. He had his ringer off. Didn't know that you were trying to reach him. The radio's on in the car. The kids are talking. There's active thing going on. They're running a little bit late. The court's not going to view it as an emergency. Even if it happens multiple times, the court's not going to view it as emergency. The court views it as emergency when the kids are being driven around by someone who's drunk. That's an emergency. The court views it as emergency when there's no heat in the house. That's an emergency. But you have to look at it. So number one, can we get emergency relief? Yeah, but do we have an emergency? If we have an emergency, then your lawyer can file an emergency motion with the court. And the way it goes is like this. He or she has to set out in a motion what the emergency is and support it with appropriate affidavits and ask the court to grant an emergency hearing. What's an emergency hearing? It could be a hearing that's done immediately, getting immediate relief on a temporary basis without even the other side knowing about it, or the court may conduct an emergency hearing on a shortened time. Most of the time when you file a motion, you're not going to get it heard before the next week or maybe even a week afterward, but the emergency docket is much smaller. Maybe you can get a hearing tomorrow at 2 o'clock or maybe something else. If the court doesn't give it immediately, maybe that's not tomorrow, then the next day. The court can shorten the time to give you an emergency hearing for emergency relief. But remember, you got to have an emergency and it's got to be adequately supported. If you have an emergency, but you don't have the support, if you call up your lawyer and say, the kids aren't home, I think he's drunk, but you don't have any basis for knowing that other than your own supposition, that is not going to fly. And you will waste probably $2,000 having your lawyer stop everything, draft a motion, run down to the court, file it, go before the judge, and have the judge say, no, that's not an emergency. Why? Because you got no proof of anything. Remember what we're dealing with here. It's not you and your friend having a conversation. It's the court and motions brought before the court and the court analyzing it through and directing people's conduct through its orders. And it doesn't do it unless there's appropriate, credible evidence that supports the allegations. So can you get emergency relief? Sure you can. But number one, let's make sure we have an emergency first. And number two, let's make sure we can support that emergency so we can prove it to the court so we don't look like idiots asking for something that we'll never get. Let's make sure that we have those things and then we can be assured that we'll get the appropriate relief. If you have any questions about that, reach out. We'll be glad to help you out.